Dear friends, in this brief reflection, let's consider why a preferential option for the poor and those who are marginalised is central to the way in which we participate in the mission of a loving and compassionate God. We can sometimes succumb to the temptation, particularly in the West, to spiritualise poverty. That is, to focus primarily on those who we might refer to as spiritually poor. Those people who passively allow life's priorities to be determined by the dominant culture. Those who've lost direction spiritually, or those who are searching for meaning in the context of a society dominated by rampant consumerism and the secular gods and idols. It is not the plight of these people that I will address here. The poor of whom I will speak today are those for whom life itself is a heavy burden. Many have no name, no recognised existence. They are people who lack adequate educational and healthcare opportunities and are excluded from decisions that affect them and their children. The poor are those who cannot take life for granted, those for whom staying alive each day is their primary task, and many of them die before their time. Scholar John Dominic Crossan refers to these people as the expendables in the eyes of the world. And Father Gustavo Gutierrez from Peru calls them the non-persons. It is our response to the plight of these people that determines our authenticity in commitment to the gospel and fidelity to the reign of God that Jesus proclaimed. Some years ago, I travelled with a friend to Sri Lanka to meet up with a theologian, Father Tissa Balasuria. When we arrived at the sprawling compound where Father Tissa lived, we were met by this little man with scraggly, long, white hair. "So you've come to talk theology," Father Tissa said when we first met. He promptly led us out of the room, down the stairs, across the compound, out into the street, and before we knew it, we were in a little rickshaw, a tuk-tuk three-wheeler that you see in Asia, and we travelled for 45 minutes to the outskirts of Colombo, to a slum area where Father Tissa had built a school for the poor. He took us to an area of an unfinished school. He took us to the roof that was about to be built upon, right in the middle of the slum. He sat us down and said, "Now we can do theology." Father Tissa didn't need to say any more. His message was very clear. We cannot do theology or reflect on the reign of God without the poor and what the gospel's message of good news means for them. As Father Gustavo Gutierrez repeatedly says, unless we place ourselves alongside the poor, unless we look at reality through their eyes, we are unable to see, to recognise, or worship the God who walks with the poor. The term preferential option for the poor is commonly used in articulating priorities for Christian mission. In Spanish, the use of the verb optar implies making a significant decision in accord with one's deepest values and priorities, a decision that has lifelong consequences. One opts to marry, to immigrate, or to pursue a certain career. For lesser choices, a different verb is used. So the choice of this verb by the Latin American theologians, who coined the phrase opción preferencial por los pobres, was deliberate, and it implies much more than a simple choice between alternatives. It implies that God makes a decision to stand with and for the poor because of the very nature of God. God prioritizes the poor because God is love and compassion and wishes full humanity for all. Poverty and marginalization are an affront to God. Living in an inhuman situation is contrary to God's will. The decision to embrace a preferential option for the poor implies a deliberate orientation of our lives and our structures towards the plight of the poor, towards their needs and concerns. It demands that we accept that we see the face of God most clearly in the poor. It requires us to accept that ignoring the poor means that we ignore God. It demands that we ask difficult questions that accept no easy answers. How do we speak of a God of love and compassion in the midst of poverty, marginalization, and exclusion? How do we tell the poor and the voiceless that God loves them and that the gospel is good news for them as well? I was walking in New Delhi, large city, the capital of India, one morning, just as the city was waking up. I came across a family, mother, father, and 4 children, who sleep on the footpath in an area of the city, just underneath an ATM machine. I watched the family prepare for the day, cooking their breakfast, rolling up their bedding, all in the shadow of this modern machine that dispenses money. I wonder what goes through the minds of people such as these when they see other people coming to the ATM machine, pushing in a few numbers, and all of a sudden, as if a miracle happens, great gifts of money flow from the machine to the lucky person who knows the code. So many questions arise. What must it be like to be a $2 a day family and not know the code? What must it feel like for that father to see other people so favoured by the gods that great quantities of money flow out to them when he, after preparing his family for the day, will have to go off and beg or work as a day labourer just for a pittance, just to keep his family alive? How do you explain to these young children that it's not their mother or father's fault that they can't access this flow of wealth in this machine that adorns their living space the way in which a painting might adorn our living rooms? How do these parents eventually explain to their children that they may never have a code to access any security and a dignified life? How could you ever convince this family on the streets of Delhi that they are sons and daughters of the same loving God who offers the fullness of life to everyone? Not long after that, I was walking one evening in Calcutta. The centre of the city becomes a dormitory for thousands of people who sleep there, just as in Delhi. And they're cleared away in the morning as the business of a busy and large city begins. Just off the main street, I encountered another family. They were asleep on the footpath in front of a modern furniture store. Just inside the window of that store was a large double bed, complete with a thick mattress and linen. This family, on the hard concrete, was separated from this comfortable bed by a simple sheet of glass. 2 worlds, a metre apart, but as different as is imaginable. more questions emerge. What stops a father from smashing the glass so that his family can have a decent place to sleep? What type of world exists that allows this stark separation? How do these children grow into any sense of why they are on the outside when there is ample unused bedding on the inside? The reign of God that Jesus proclaimed ushered in a new world order characterized by relationships of justice, love, and peace. The Hebrew word for peace is shalom. Shalom refers not so much to the absence of violence, but to the right order of things, to health, prosperity, security, political and spiritual well-being. It implies that there's a sense of equity and fairness in the way that we deal with one another. There is not shalom if the children go hungry. If human rights are ignored, there is no shalom. There is no shalom in a world indifferent to the common good. Since becoming Pope, Francis has consistently prayed for a church of and for the poor. A church that promotes service and compassionate engagement with the world as indispensable to the way in which we worship a God who stands with and for the poor. A church that strives to usher in the reign of God, the promise of fullness of life and true freedom for all. A church focused on getting the reign of God and its message of justice and truth into the world rather than people into its ranks. A church not so worried about how the world might change it, but rather how it might strive to change the world. And a church that strives ceaselessly to tell the poor and the excluded ones that God loves them and that the gospel is good news for them as well. There is no other path to God but the path of justice. We have a preferential option, but we have no choice. Some might say that it's easier to embrace a mission of radical inclusion and an option for the poor in places like India, Africa, Latin America, some parts, as material poverty and exclusion are very visible. However, when we're tempted to think this way, let's remember the words of Mother Teresa. We can do no great things, only small things with great love. Calcutta can be found all over the world, if only we have eyes to see. Your task is to find Calcutta wherever you are. Thank you for all that you do.